This talk today is based on a paper that was just published in August in the journal titled Emancipations, the Journal of Critical Social Analysis. The article is titled The Social Murder of Victoria Salazar, Neoliberal Capitalism and Working Class Precariousness in El Salvador. And this research emerges from my own participation in activism and organizing and influence from the things I've seen, the things I've participated in. Between 2014 and 2020, I was part of a formation called the Human Rights Alliance for Child Refugees and Families. And it was, I wouldn't say it was an organization because it started off as a formation of different organizations and individuals, and then just ended up becoming a group of individuals that were trying to accompany Central American youth that were fleeing Central America, and mothers and trans women that were fleeing Central America that were being detained in these private detention centers at the border. So I spent a lot of time just listening and learning from their experiences and just talking to them, and just understanding the problems, right? A lot of the research that I write about oftentimes comes from that, from just listening and learning from people and then thinking theoretically about these problems, right? And so a lot of that stuff was documented by one of the comrades of mine named Jennifer Cárcamo, who's currently doing her PhD in history at UCLA. And she filmed it also. She documented it all through film and made a documentary called Los Eternos Indocumentados. The film, you could find it online. So if you're interested in understanding the root causes of Central American migration beyond today's conversation, I really recommend this film. Diana actually invited us in 2019 or 2018, I think, to talk about the film here on campus, on your campus. Again, she did an amazing job, and I can't wait for her. I'm on her dissertation committee now. I can't wait to see her dissertation and her PhD at the end of this whole trek. But this documentary, I really recommend it. You should definitely write it down and watch it. It's free online now. So again, as I said, this was part of this experience. And so in 2021, March 27th, 2021, a Salvadoran refugee named Victoria Salazar was murdered by police in the Mexican resort town of Tulum, Quintana. 4 police officers surrounded and detained Ms. Salazar for allegedly disturbing the peace. While being detained, she fell to the ground and 2 of the police officers, 1 woman, 1 man, climbed on her back. Victoria Salazar yelled for help while the woman police officer knelt on her neck. She stopped screaming and moving. Instead of an ambulance arriving to provide aid, Ms. Salazar was handcuffed and shoved in the back of a pickup truck. In March 2018, she had received a humanitarian visa from the Mexican authorities. 3 years later, her neck was broken by Mexican police. The autopsy report found that Ms. Salazar suffered a fracture in the upper part of the spine. This conversation is going to be difficult because the reality of our people is difficult. People fleeing the conditions in Central America is difficult. So I do want to just start off with that. This conversation and this discussion will be difficult to have, right? Victoria Salazar was from Sonsonate, El Salvador. In Sonsonate, 43% of the population live in what the Salvadoran Ministry of Finance calls multidimensional poverty, which includes inadequate access to education, housing, secure employment, health services, and a substandard quality of life. Victoria Salazar left El Salvador in 2016 with her 2 daughters, ages 15 and 16. According to her mother, she left because there was no job opportunities or ways to make a living in El Salvador. At the time that she was fleeing El Salvador, El Salvador had one of the highest rates of feminicides, with a man killing a woman every 24 hours. So Victoria was fleeing these conditions, right, and trying to find refuge somewhere else, right? She stopped in Mexico. Her idea was to make it to the U.S., but the routes were too difficult for her and her 2 daughters, so she decided to stay in Mexico. She found work in Tulum. Tulum is a tourist town. I'm sure some of us have heard of Tulum, right? The majority of the money of income that comes in Tulum is tourism. So she found work during the COVID pandemic, cleaning hotels for people that were traveling during the COVID pandemic. The same month that she was murdered by the Mexican authorities, same month, the U.S. Senate Committee on Armed Services held a hearing with testimony from Navy Admiral Craig Fowler, which is commander of the U.S. Southern Command. The U.S. has command bases all around the world. U.S. Northern Command, U.S. Southern Command, AFRICOM, right? U.S. AFRICOM, right? Southern Command focuses on Latin America. So this is his view, this admiral. During his speech, he said that his neighborhood, our neighborhood, the United States' neighborhood, no longer the backyard, but the neighborhood is part of Latin America, he said. And two of the biggest problems in Latin America, he said, are transnational criminal organizations and the Communist Party of China. He said, while the Communist Party of China is trying to get into the politics of Latin America, transnational criminal organizations are destabilizing Latin America. So these two things are the biggest threat of our neighborhood. I mentioned this conversation to a friend of mine, and he found it very interesting. That it almost sounded like gang politics. Our neighborhood, this is our hood. You gotta take care of it, right? Yet not in conversation with Latin Americans, obviously, right? Now, if we think of the logic of Fowler, the argument we could make is that, well, Victoria fled El Salvador because of the violence of transnational criminal organizations, right? Gangs, and I'm sure we've heard of the very famous MS-13, right? Trump had it all over his mouth for a very long time, right? Most of the times when we hear people fleeing, those are the two things that come up: poverty and gangs. Women are fleeing poverty and gangs, right? So this argument would make sense to some of us. Yes, transnational criminal organizations, and yeah, the Communist Party of China, or China as the problem, right? But if we really look at the history of Latin America and its relationship, these are far from the problems that Victoria was fleeing, right? The logic that Fowler was arguing was in fact the problem, right? The involvement of the U.S. in the U.S.'s foreign policy in El Salvador and Central America, but beyond the foreign policy, the foreign policy of economic policies, right? The neoliberal economic doctrine in Latin America that has destroyed communities throughout Latin America, specifically Central America. So again, when they started pushing on Fowler and asking him, like, well, should we really be supporting, like, be so involved in Latin America? Like, isn't Honduras, a country that we've been supporting for so much, have tons of human rights violations? And recently, the last president was indicted and brought over here for drug trafficking. Well, his argument was, well, if we don't back them up, they won't improve their conditions. They won't improve their police professionalism. They need us to improve their police professionalism, right? Well, that in fact happened. A few weeks after Victoria was murdered by the police were brought in, the Tulum police were brought in, and they were given police professionalism training, right? Now, if the U.S. has a long history of involvement in Mexico through the Merida Initiative, funding the drug war, and funding police professionalism in Mexico. So the argument is, let's prepare police to be better equipped to handle these problems. Now, we know the problems in the United States with policing and police professionalism. So we know how far that goes, right? So what I want to argue in this paper is that we need to think beyond Fowler's argument that becomes common sense to a lot of us. Again, when we think of Central America, again, like I said, and I want to hit this in the head, we oftentimes think of poverty and gangs. Poverty and gangs. Those are the two things we hear that our people are fleeing. Right? But it's deeper than that. Those might be the actual things we see, but there's deeper problems in Central America that we need to understand. So what I want us to think about is that this feminist side that we're hearing about in Central America, the poverty that we're seeing in Central America, has deeper roots, right? So when we see this sign here, fue el Estado, and this is a very famous statement that's happening throughout Mexico, throughout Latin America, that it's the states involved in the process, right? That the police killed Victoria Salazar. Well, the state is part of a larger system, right? We need to think of what is this global capitalist system that we live in, right? That requires a capitalist state. So the purpose of this paper that I wrote, and the argument that I was proposing, is that I wanted to introduce what has been called a proletarian feminist analysis to the study of Central American displacement and forced migration to argue that Victoria Salazar's death is a social murder, right? And I'll get into what I mean by a social murder. And also what a proletarian feminist analysis is. Although Mexican police murdered Victoria Salazar, I contend that the social degradation and working class precariousness in El Salvador and Mexico, all shaped by neoliberal capitalist relations of exploitation and afflicting cisgender and trans women in distinctive ways, set the condition for Ms. Salazar's social murder. Right? So that's what I want us to think about. So we know that we saw who killed them. There's footage of who killed Victoria. But beyond who killed Victoria, we need to think of this as a social murder, and I'll describe what that means. Right? Through a proletarian feminist analysis, I demonstrate that working class precariousness of Salvadoran women is a primary contradiction of capitalism, which is exacerbated under its current stage of neoliberal capitalism. So this idea of social murder, right? A week after Victoria Salazar was murdered, her body was returned to her family in Sonsonate. During the burial, her brother Carlos Salazar was interviewed by the press. And I quote, "No one managed to understand what happened," he said, "because it looks like she's asking for help at one point, and suddenly the police arrive and subdue her, and in less than 10 seconds, they already killed her." He declares, "Nobody did anything to help her. They left her like a dog dead there," unquote. After Ms. Salazar's murder, Mexican authorities arrested her Mexican boyfriend on allegations that he abused her 16-year-old daughter, and sexually assaulted her 15-year-old daughter. 2 weeks before her murder, she appeared before the local child protection services to formally accuse him of sexually assaulting her daughter. She then took her daughter to a shelter to protect her. In El Salvador, agents of the state did not provide dignified living conditions for Salazar's family, and in Mexico, agents of the state neglected her family's safety and took her life. Ultimately, she could not flee the misogyny that crosses national borders. For many working class women in El Salvador and in Central America, in their home countries as well as abroad, social murder is a daily reality. So this idea of social murder, I'm building off of this idea from Frederick Engels, and he wrote this in The Conditions of the Working Class in England in 1845. So he was trying to understand the reality of working class people in England at this moment, looking at their housing conditions, at their health conditions, at the food they were eating, at their working conditions, all these different conditions that they were living under, right? And he started realizing that a lot of people were dying early, premature death, right? But there wasn't anyone shooting them or killing them or strangling them, or they were just dying because of those living conditions they had, right? The poor conditions that they lived in. So he started to think about this as a social murder, because you don't know the murderer, you don't know the killer, but it's the systemic problems of the world that are killing you, right? So this is what's murdering them, he says. He says, it's disguised malicious murder, a murder against which no one can defend themselves, which does not seem what it is because no one sees the murderer, because the death of the victim seems a natural one, since the offense is more of one of omission than of commission. Now, you could push back and be like, well, but we do know who the murderer is with Victoria Salazar, right? It was the police, right? But what I want us to think about is what got her to that moment at that time. Why does Victoria have to be in Tulum in that moment? Why wasn't she at home in Sonsonate with her daughters in El Salvador? What forced her to flee? What's forcing many women and trans women, including, to flee El Salvador, right? Thinking through the idea of a social murder, we could start thinking about the structural conditions in El Salvador that are leading people to these conditions, that leading ultimately to their deaths in certain places, right? Like Victoria Salazar, which produces conditions, what we call working class precariousness. There's been a lot of discussion of this idea of precarity. It's a very common debate in academic studies, right? The idea of precarity, that it's a very new thing under neoliberalism, that people are more precarious in their conditions, meaning their housing conditions, their work conditions are more precarious. There's more contractual labor, right? It's difficult to, think about Uber and Lyft and all these different ways that people are trying to survive, right? It's very precarious. Others have argued that actually, no, this has always been the case. If we look at the historical understanding of capitalism, if we look at the development of capitalism and what Marx called the general law of capitalist accumulation, that it produces what's oftentimes called a relative surplus population, or a population that's redundant to capital, that it's pushed out of the system, right? That capitalism has always produced this, right? That it's always created what we call a surplus population, right? And then this surplus, oftentimes we think of, is criminalized, is demonized, right? Think about the current conditions in LA with the houseless conditions, right? If you watch TV, you turn on today, I was at home with my son. If you turn on TV, what are the commercials about? The crisis, right? And crime specifically of the houseless, right? And how each person running for mayor is going to be tough on crime, right? And it's oftentimes focused on the surplus, right? People that have been pushed out of the system, right? Now, but this surplus population is not just that; it's different layers of the surplus, right? And so the idea that people are living in what we call working class precariousness, right? And I'm sure if some of us in this classroom come from working class families, you know what I'm talking about. You feel what I'm talking about, what working class precariousness is, right? Those living conditions that our parents have to struggle to survive, right? Those things are a reality that a lot of us have normalized. Right? Now, when you look at places like El Salvador, those conditions are exacerbated under the current neoliberal model. And I'll discuss that more in a bit. So this idea of the general law of capitalist accumulation, there's a passage that stands out that I want us to think about. Accumulation of wealth at one pole is therefore at the same time accumulation of misery, the torment of labor, slavery, ignorance, brutalization, and more degradation at the opposite pole. Now, this is not to create this pathology of the poor, that, they're morally degraded or that they're ignorant, but the idea of the conditions that are produced about them. The ideas we think about the poor, right? It's more about those things, right? The conditions of the poor, what we think about the poor, why people are poor, right? We think about the culture of poverty, right? There's all these theories that try to justify why people are poor, rather than just saying capitalism produces these conditions. Their culture is backwards. They're not trying hard enough, right? We find all these other reasons to blame them, right? When we think of the caravans that are migrating, there's a huge debate about that. Why are people coming? Like, it's a simple question, but also there's so much behind that question. Why are people coming, right? Remember, Trump said, why are people coming from these shithole countries? That statement. Yeah, there's so much in that. I teach an immigration class, and I start with that quote. I'll be like, we're going to get deep into that statement. Why people come from these shithole countries, right? Coming to another shithole country, right? We'll get into this debate, right? So we get into that. But again, this accumulation of wealth in one pole. When you have accumulation here, what happens to the rest of the people, right? So I want us to think about that when thinking of Victoria, right? And their current conditions. But I want us to think through that through what it's called a proletarian feminist perspective. And I write there that it's a growing perspective in struggle, meaning that this is not a theory that's already developed, formed in academic debates. This is something that's forming itself currently in struggle, in active spaces in the global south. People actually fighting these conditions of imperialism and global capitalism, right? A developing idea, right? From past mistakes of past proletarian struggles. Right? Learning from the past mistakes, trying to understand how do we move forward in a better analysis of struggle, right? And these ideas I'm building off of someone named Anuradha Gandhi and others, but specifically her writings. And her writings are based from the Maoist communist struggles in India. And in her writings, she has an analysis, what some people have argued is an analysis from oppression and exploitation in the peripheries of global capitalism, right? Oftentimes we read feminisms from the mainstreams of global capitalism. We oftentimes don't read about the peripheries of global capitalism, right? Peripheries, the colonial conditions, right? So she's writing these ideas from this perspective. Right? Now, what does she argue, right? That gendered and racialized class subjects face exploitation and oppression in differential ways, right? In differential ways. That we face these conditions, gendered and racialized people face oppression and exploitation in differential ways in this one system. That it's a dialectical relationship between class and struggle and gender oppression. That is not one is more important than the other. That they inform each other. That it's a dialectical relationship, right? That you can't change one without the other, and the other can't be changed without the other. It's back and forth, right? And that he has to be constantly thinking about how they're both informing each other. She pushes back on this idea that the roots of oppression trace control toward the means of production rather than the sexual division of labor, right? Some have argued that it's the root of women's oppression is the sexual division of labor. She actually says, well, yes, but also it's about the control of power over the means of production, over the production of society, over control of the resources of society. That's the root, right, she says. Not the division of the labor, but the political power. Right? This is a political question, she says. Yeah? And the only way to change that is through political power, she argues, right? Women having political power, right? The role of women in participating in actual struggle, right? So again, thinking of those three ideas, the social murder, working class precariousness through a proletarian feminist lens, right? Focusing on the conditions of Salvadoran women and trans women, right? Looking at it through this perspective. Now, to understand that, though, we obviously have to look at El Salvador and its history, right, through this lens. Many have argued that the soldiers' degradation of women, including trans women, have been structured by colonial, capitalist, and imperial structures of domination. Another thing that oftentimes is said that people are also fleeing the machismo of Salvadoran men. And one thing we need to think about is how does that machismo or patriarchy emerge? Is it innate in men? Sometimes the argument gets to that point where there's almost like an innateness that men are men are trash. And we're trash. We are trash, but we've been socialized to be trash. We've been socialized by colonial, imperial, and capitalist structures. And they're really convincing and seductive, yeah. But that doesn't mean that that's just how it is. If we think that's just how it is, then we have no hope. Gandhi would argue, no, that's not what it is. You have to struggle against that, yeah. So understanding it in that perspective, then what got us to this point in there, right? Again, talking about that long history, but let's focus more current in this current moment. When we look at this Civil War, we oftentimes in Central American studies, people a lot of focus on the Civil War because it's a pivotal period, right? And we just think of it as a civil war and not a revolutionary struggle, right? There is people involved to try to change the conditions, and women were very actively involved in that. A lot of scholars have started writing about the role of women in these armed struggles, right? Because oftentimes armed struggles make sounds to be very masculine. But actually, women were very involved in this process, creating socialist feminist perspectives in these movements, right? Trying to challenge the vestiges of patriarchy and the men that were involved in these struggles, right? It wasn't like they were just passive. They were very active in trying to challenge those things. But they had something else to contend with, U.S. foreign policy, right? The involvement of the U.S. in defending the right-wing governments of Central America, specifically in El Salvador, right? Give me one moment. For example, in responses to the struggles for national and social liberation in El Salvador, U.S. President Ronald Reagan stated in a 1984 address to the nation, quote, "Central America is a region of great importance to the United States. It is at our doorstep, and it becomes a stage for a bold attempt by the Soviet Union, Cuba, and Nicaragua to install communism by force throughout the hemisphere." In the 1980s, the Reagan administration financed the right-wing government of Salvador and their militarization of the country, producing a generalized state terror against the Salvadoran population. The revolutionaries of El Salvador were indeed fighting for socialism, but were not forced by other socialist governments. It was a grassroots mobilization against the internal contradictions. In this struggle, women played a fundamental role in challenging both imperialist plundering and the vestiges of patriarchy. As Diana Sierra Becerra notes, women's mass organizations, such as the Association of Women of El Salvador, AMES, were actively developing a revolutionary feminist praxis. Despite this revolutionary attempt, the conditions described that they were fighting for persisted, right? So there was a civil war in El Salvador between 1980 and 1992. During this period, as I just described, the U.S. funded over, I'm losing the number right now, but billions of dollars, right? Involved in maintaining the structures in place, right? But obviously they didn't win because this movement was so strong. There was a stalemate, and they needed a peace treaty to maintain it. Unfortunately, this peace treaty did not transform the Salvadoran society. What it really did just bring in neoliberalism, right? It brought in the restructuring of Salvadoran society. So prior to that was an oligarchy controlling the land of the country. With neoliberalism, it opened it up to the market. Right? It globalized El Salvador, right? Brought in maquilas, right? Restructured the economy, right? Privatized industries, right? All that started transforming after 92. To this point, to this today, right? We have free trade policies, right? We have all these different things in El Salvador that have made it much more difficult for people. A lot of people have been arguing, though, at the same time, is that these peace treaties never had a gendered lens, meaning that it wasn't the role of women we're thinking about when we think about land distribution, the effects of structural adjustment. What would that do to women and their children? What would that do to LGBT communities that actually were being ignored in this period, right? Those things that often have been thought about lately, right? And have been pushed about even at that moment. People were discussing that. How are we going to take into account these communities, right? So, Victoria Salazar, give me a moment. She left almost 3 decades after the Civil War, right? After the peace accords that was supposed to bring democracy. And it was actually celebrated worldwide by the United Nations that, look, here's an example of democracy promotion in El Salvador. The Civil War ended, there's peace, right? But again, these conditions that we see in the country exacerbated, right? To the point, again, that when we think of El Salvador, most people think of gangs. Right? Never thinking about this history that produces the conditions, right? So when Victoria left El Salvador, fled El Salvador, 32% of the population in El Salvador lived in poverty, with 25% in relative poverty and 8% in extreme poverty. %, of working age women in the workforce are in the workforce, while 53% were inactive, right? 53% of the population was inactive, meaning that they weren't working, they weren't living off of their own being, right? They represent 76% of the inactive population and 30% of the unemployed. Now again, thinking about this perspective, this proletarian perspective of power, right? Of work, of labor, of organizing, right? Of having power over that. 49% of working women form part of the informal economy. Now think about the informal economy, right? What conditions are in the informal economy? It's very precarious. There's no security, right? There's no health care, right? There's no, all these different things that come with an actual quote unquote legitimate job you don't have under these informal economies. Now when we think of their role in the actual quote unquote public sector or the actual formally employed jobs, 45% work in the service sector, 17% manufacturing, 12% in domestic work, 10% in social and health services, right? %37% were salary, the rest were contractual workers. Again, we've talked about I've mentioned a little bit what contractual work is, right? 34% covered by Social Security, 23% had access to health care. Very small numbers. You know, when we think of access to health care, right? I know we struggle with that in this country, but access to health care is huge. I myself am a cancer survivor. The only reason I survived cancer is because I have a petty bourgeois job and a union that gave me health care. If I would have been working class Steven without that health care, and I found that tumor, I wouldn't be here. And it was because of having health care, right? So when we think of like that, these are just numbers, but these numbers produce livelihood. They produce the ability to live dignified lives, right? When Victoria fled El Salvador, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights notes that, quote, hate crimes, assaults, acts of discrimination, exclusion, denial of services, stigma, and marginalization continue to be the reality for Salvadoran LGBTQI people, with high rates of poverty, low schooling, murders, and low probability of life beyond 33 years. Right? I just turned 40 in December. Well, I'm going to be 41 in December. Right? 33 years. Yeah? I know a lot of you are not 33 yet. 33 is so young. Since 1993, there have been 600 recorded murders of LGBTQI people and 151 cases of forced displacement between January 2018 and September 2019. And these are just reported cases, right? That's another thing we have to think about. These are all government and non-governmental organization statistics, yeah? This is not there's a lot of stuff that goes uncovered, right? Even when we're talking about their participation in labor, right? During February 2017 alone, 3 trans women were brutally murdered within a 72-hour period. Again, working class precariousness. The Human Rights Ombudsman of El Salvador found that 85% of trans women surveyed rely on prostitution to survive, and 45% survive on only $180 a month. One thing to emphasize with the restructuring of the neoliberal economy in El Salvador, the El Salvadoran economy is dollars, is US dollar, right? So a gallon of gas in El Salvador is $5, $6, right? But you're not paid like we paid here. So it's something to keep in mind when we're thinking of the dollarization of the country. So when someone's living on $180 a month, right? And when their only way to survive was sex work or prostitution. And this is a big debate, right, about the idea of sex work is work. It's like, well, what about that's the only way of livelihood? Is it really that's your choice? That's the thing we need to debate about. Is that really a choice? When Victoria fled El Salvador, in 2018, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights received over 1,000 registered complaints of violence in the workplace by women, 60% of which were complaints of labor or sexual harassment. The maquila industry is a big thing here in El Salvador. I'm sure if we look, some of us might, if we look at your shirt, you might say made in El Salvador. Right? So this was made by Salvadoran working class women. But this is the thing here to think. While only employing 70% of the female workforce, the maquila industry, whose clients are international brands like Adidas, Pumas, Nike, and Walmart, exported $2.4 billion in 2014, half of El Salvador's total sales abroad. Again, controlling the mode of production, controlling political power over those resources. 17% of the women in El Salvador made half of the wealth of the country. Half of not the wealth of the country, but the sales abroad. Right? So only 17%. However, these companies have been known to hire gang members who are part of also the surplus population, right? Because here's not to talk about, this is another sector of the surplus, people that join gangs. They hire them to threaten workers who are organizing for better working conditions, for unionization, right? So these workers in the maquila industry are oftentimes trying to find ways of getting better working conditions. And they organize themselves and try to create unions. And the union busting here they hire part of the other surplus, right? Poor working class men to disrupt these unions. So when Victoria Salazar fled El Salvador, immiseration of the Salvadoran working class produces structural violence that affects cisgender and trans women in differential ways. Remember the idea of differential ways. In 2018 alone, according to the Attorney General of El Salvador, over 6,000 women were victims of sexual violence, including 2,600 cases of rape. Again, only the ones that have been documented. From 2015 to June 2019, there were 692 reported acts of violence perpetrated against members of the LGBTQI communities, including 72 homicides. Salvador has been known for the criminalization of abortion. At least 74 women who have suffered obstetric emergencies have been sentenced to up to 40 years in prison. For LGBTQI communities, there are no specialized care policies that respond to their specific issues. Again, access to basic services are fundamental for our dignity and livelihood. Now, unfortunately, when people are fleeing these conditions, leave these conditions and arrive in Mexico, instead of receiving a statewide solidarity and support of their conditions, oftentimes they're receiving what we could think of as a Mexican national chauvinism, right? A chauvinism towards Central Americans, right? Now, this is not to say that everyone in Mexico feels this way. There's documentation of a lot of solidarity from grassroots organizations. But the popular common sense, just like the popular common sense here, is very anti-immigrant, right? And we need to tie also that to the material conditions that produces that, the anxieties that people are living under, right? The racism that people have internalized, right? The neoliberal restructuring of Mexico has also hollowed out Mexico, where over 50% of the population are also living in poverty, right? So they're very immiserated. So again, when we think of these Central American caravans that have been happening since the 2015, 16, right? We need to think of them as exoduses. People are fleeing these conditions that I was describing. But these conditions, again, are rooted in the political economy and how that is shaping the existence of people. In Mexico, Central American cisgender and trans women are particularly vulnerable to discrimination and violence, especially sexual harassment and assault by employers. So people that hire them while they're there, right? Some people decide to stay. They're facing difficult situations. Let's think of Victoria. Nine in 10 women are subjected to sexual labor exploitation by police, military, and formal economies in their route through migrating. Right? Again, these things are just hard to hear and to think about. A 2019 survey conducted by the Washington Post and Reforma, which is a very national newspaper in Mexico, found that 6 in 10 Mexicans saw Central American migrants and refugees as a burden on their country because they take jobs and benefits from Mexicans. Sounds very familiar. Mexico's dealing with its own feminicide, right, with sexual violence. Kills 10 women a day in Mexico. So when this happened in 2021, a lot of people started making the parallels to George Floyd, right? Similar conditions, right? They died by similar approaches by the police with a knee or a boot on the neck, right? And so the international news was comparing these. This is a year after, right? 2020 and 2021. When the international mass media covered the death of Victoria Salazar, there were immediate references and comparisons to the murder of George Floyd, a black man killed in the U.S. by police in Minneapolis, Minnesota in 2020. Both Victoria Salazar and George Floyd were members of a racialized working class trying to survive this quote-unquote decadent civilization. Despite their differential experiences of racialized and gender class exploitation and oppression, the two victims were part of a transnational relative surplus population whose movement was criminalized. They sought a better future through migration, yet this future was cut short. For them, the precarity of neoliberal capitalism ended in social murder. So towards the conclusion, because this is only a conversation, this is not the end, right? I oftentimes think of the stuff I write as ongoing. This is just not the last word. But as this proletarian perspective, feminist perspective that I've been learning about and reading about offers, right? That the only way out of this terrain that I'm discussing are the formation of revolutionary mass organizations and their struggle against capitalist imperialism or global capitalism, right? And we need to take those struggles seriously, right? Listening to them, actually, what are they struggling on the ground, right? So me reading Gandhi seriously, what are she saying? That left social movements and political organizations, I believe here, must center international solidarity in the long tradition of internationalism to prevent the further capitulation to national chauvinism, like I was talking with Mexicans in the country, moral panics waged against the relative surplus populations, against the anti-immigrant hysteria or hysteria against the houseless population, and heteropatriarchal violence from working class men, because again, men are trash, but we gotta organize to change that. Internationalism requires the organizing of international solidarity, since solidarity is not a given. We oftentimes say that, I'm in solidarity, but it's not a given, it's a practice. We have to act it out, right? And organize towards it. Neoliberal capitalism may produce the conditions for social murder, but people resist social death. I do want to emphasize that, right? This idea of social murder can be changed, right? Because people constantly are challenging these conditions of social death. Right? Despite this heaviness of this paper that I wrote, despite the experience that I've heard about and learned about, I still have the optimism that people struggle against these conditions, right? That people are finding ways in their countries to fight these conditions, and oftentimes need our solidarity, international solidarity, and support them. Like, how do we struggle here to support conditions over there, right? That's been a long-term time question I've had in my mind for a very long time. And one way I think about it is writing about these things. As an academic, I write, right? I think about these ideas, aside from my participation in activism and organizing, right? But how do I write these ideas and popularize them? Yeah? So that's why I opened up the invitation. Now come, let's talk about this, right? At the end of the marches, because when she was murdered, Mexican feminists went to the streets, right? They chanted and were fighting and burning stuff down in Tulum. And one thing that stood out in those states, la policía no me cuida, me cuidan mis amigas. The police don't take care of me, my girlfriends do. That's an example of, like, again, not relying on a capitalist state or even expecting it to take care of you, but really relying on organizations outside of the state. And what Gandhi would argue is revolutionary-based organizations, meaning the idea of actually thinking of an alternative system, right? For Gandhi, this obvious alternative system was the socialism towards communism, right? Now, again, this is a question that it could be debated, but that was the ideas that she had, because she passed away, right? But those are the ideas that she had moving forward. And even with her own movement, she was challenging the vestiges of patriarchy in this Communist Party. She recognized that a lot of these communist men had patriarchal, misogynist ideas, but the only way to change it was through organizing, pushing them to change themselves, right? To remold themselves, right? So I think that you shared the paper with them, right? I hope you read it. If you didn't read it, I really hope you could ask me some questions, because I wanted to open it up more for a conversation rather than me just talking this whole time. I could have gone a lot slower, but I didn't want to, because hopefully y'all have questions, and I also wanted to hear Diana roast me. So me and Diana know each other for a very long time, so when I saw that she was going to comment on the paper, I was very honored and happy. So I'll leave it there.